We're very excited today, as part of Modern Money Australia, to host Dr. Martin Watts, who's an Emeritus Professor at the University of Newcastle. Modern Money Australia itself is a community organisation which is dedicated to promoting an awareness of and providing free educational resources about modern monetary theory, which is a new analytical framework for how the economy works. We are running these events so that people can improve their own understanding of MMT, as well as understand the policy space that it opens up to governments to pursue various policy agendas which may not have been previously available to them under the orthodox framework. So Dr. Martin Watts has a wealth of experience in economics and teaching economics and working as an economist. For 16 years, he was a lecturer / senior lecturer at Monash University until he moved to Newcastle in 1991, I believe, where he's been working since. And has been head of School of Policy, I think it was at one point, and which has changed name a few times. He was also deputy director of the Centre of Full Employment and Equity from 1998 to 2007, and has a variety of specializations, key of which to our talk today is sort of labor markets and macroeconomics. And he recently co-authored with Dr. William Mitchell and Dr. Randall Ray, Macroeconomics, which is a groundbreaking new textbook, which looks at the economy from a new, more factual perspective. So if you're curious to learn more about MMT, this is an excellent resource. And I think with that, I might pass on to Dr. Watts now for the main event, which is today's presentation. So I'll just pass on to you now, Dr. Watts. And now you are the focus of the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yep, your audio is coming through fine.
Okay, well, thanks, Joshua, for the invitation from you and your colleagues at Modern Money Australia. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity of talking again. I was down in Melbourne last year for a session with the Melbourneites. This clearly hasn't been possible this year. Let's hope we can get back to some face-to-face contact sometime next year. So this topic is clearly fairly current. I'm not going to talk about MMT for some time, as you'll discover. I'm going to run through a range of policies that have been put forward and provide some sort of critique of them. And then I will move towards discussing MMT in the context of the achievement of full employment, which I think is integral to the appropriate long-term strategy. Final comment before I go to the actual slides is that many say, well, MMT has now arrived. And I think that is misleading in the sense that MMT is a lens on how the economy actually functions, as opposed to what's written in most textbooks. And in terms of the need for active fiscal policy, really for the last 40 years, since the Friedmanite revolution, you might say, in terms of the importance of monetary policy, since that took place. So we've had high underutilization of labour really since the 70s. And so there's been a pressing need for active fiscal policy for many years. Okay, now to the formal part, and here are the slides. Okay, so the ongoing pandemic, as we know, has imposed major damage to the macroeconomy. There's been a significant rise in unemployment, which is partially hidden by the JobKeeper arrangements, because recipients of JobKeeper who have been essentially stood down are included as employed. There's also been a significant rise in unemployment, and as we know, there is some notable groups who are excluded from JobKeeper, and young people have been particularly affected. We have devastated sections of the economy, including transport, tourism, arts, entertainment and hospitality. And there has been this problem with the breakdown of international supply chains, which has really increased Australia's vulnerability in terms of food and energy security and the maintenance of good health in the current pandemic and in respect of future health emergencies. And something...
I'll just interrupt. We just haven't seen your slides yet. Can we just make sure that you've shared your screen? Sometimes the functionality can be a bit stilted.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry for this, everyone. Just a moment of patience.
Okay. Right. Now, just find it. Here we go.
There we are. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Just moving forward. Sorry, moving back. Okay, so I've mentioned the unemployment and I've mentioned underemployment, the devastated sectors of the economy, the breakdown of supply chain. And the last point here is rapid and unanticipated structural change in respect of the way that leisure time activities will take place and equally daily patterns of work, which I think will leave long-term changes in the structure of employment. Of course, the existing economic and social disparities were very much reinforced by some groups in the community being able to work from home, and yet others, of course, were unable to do so. It's important to note that the macroeconomy was not flourishing before the recession. Wages growth has been somewhat insipid, and there's been a long-term slump in private investment since the minerals boom. So there's been a weak growth of aggregate demand. Sorry, I'm just going to full screen and then that's better. The macro crisis really has its origins in the 40-year dominance of neoliberal policymaking, which involved market-friendly initiatives, which led to privatization and deregulation of product and labor markets. There's been a reduced role for the state in terms of lower public investment and some important major structural and regulatory changes which have reduced the effective power of labour and really enhanced employers' capacity to set wages and make workplace decisions. There has also been some major changes in terms of training and reconnecting the unemployed with the labour market. And of course, the obsession with free trade has been to the exclusion of any consideration of strategic needs. It's also worth pointing out, of course, that there was a major exercise some months ago looking at the implications of a major pandemic conducted in Australia, and the Australian government really didn't make any appropriate preparations in anticipation of a pandemic in the future. And certainly the pandemic has highlighted some very deep fissures in the social and economic fabric, which are likely to worsen without a major fiscal policy strategy. So in this presentation, I'm going to first of all talk about the deteriorating state of the labour market. briefly summarize the initiatives, the major initiatives that have been taken by the federal government, and note that there is evidence of pushback. I'm going to then outline and assess some detailed policy initiatives which have been advocated in the last few weeks. And the main one is a very interesting piece of work by the Grattan Institute, where they've got a lot of thoughtful and sensible suggestions. I'm going to talk about MMT principles in section 5, fiscal and monetary policy in section 6, and then I'll talk about a coherent full employment policy framework through a job guarantee. And I see that as absolutely essential if we're going to do something serious in respect of the inequality, which has become more significant really since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, here's a table with some important numbers in. You can see down the first column, we have employed, unemployed, labour force participation, and so on. And we have that for 2 months, March 2020 and May 2020. And then in the third column, you get some idea of the deterioration of the labour market, with employment dropping nearly 860,000, unemployment going up 208, participation falling, the unemployment rate rising, and labour underutilisation, underemployment, the rate of underemployment rising, and labour underutilisation, which is a rather crude measure, has risen by the sum of the increase in the unemployment rate and the increase in the underemployment rate. It's also worth noting the reduction in total labour hours, which is 185 million. And you can see that the monthly hours per job has fallen. So the monthly hours is not simply a product of reduced employment, it's also a reflection of people working fewer hours. Now, in the final column, what I've done is to impose the participation rate of 66%, which prevailed in March, and assigned the extra workers that would be in the labour force in May into unemployment, because the participation rate does move around, and typically when a recession starts occurring, people give up looking for work, and hence the participation rate does go down. So this is saying if the participation rate had stayed unchanged and those extra workers in the labour force were unemployed, which is what one would expect, you wouldn't expect them to be employed, then the unemployment rate would be markedly higher, as you can see, 11.5% rather than 7.1%. And that would then impact on the underutilisation rate as well. So that's what I've done there. It's important to note, as I think I mentioned earlier, JobKeeper recipients are classified as employed regardless of hours worked, even if they're stood down. And about 3.5 million are receiving the payment. The ABS estimated that the unemployment rate would have been 11.3% in May, as opposed to 7.1% if the stood down workers were included. If we also include the hidden unemployed associated with the fall in the participation rate, then we get a very high rate of unemployment of 15.5%. I then indicate the major sectors that have lost employment. And this was very much in the light of the reintroduction of mutual obligation, which has begun, which is the obligations on the unemployed to look for work. Job vacancies had fallen by 43% from February to May, so they're down to 129.1 thousand. Unemployment, just the simple level of unemployment as shown in the table, is 927,000. So even ignoring the hidden JobKeeper unemployment and the hidden unemployment, you've got an unemployment to vacancy ratio of over 7. And you don't have to be a genius to work out that even if all the vacancies would be filled, there's a rather large cohort of the 927,000 unemployed would not be getting a job. Okay, it's worth noting some consequences of major recessions. And what is typical of any recession is that the unemployment rate rises much quicker than it then declines in recoveries. And it has a long-lasting consequence for those who are affected. Long-term unemployed suffer skills erosion, they have less relevant experience, they lose touch with both professional and social networks, they become less attractive to employers who note they have not been hired in previous months. Wayne, you've got a question. Silence. Well, I'll continue, but Wayne has raised his hand. The adverse impact on young people who graduate during recessions is long-term. So if you think of a cohort of graduates emerging this year who simply don't get employed and then they're competing with new grads 12 months later, then the cohort from this year looks rather unattractive. During a long-term recession, the unemployment rate impacts on the inflationary process, and this is known as hysteresis, because the movements of the unemployment rate impact on the rate of unemployment at which inflation is stable. And that's very important. Bill Mitchell has done a lot of work on that in the past. Orthodoxy tends to view recessions as just temporary deviations from a long-run growth path. They impact adversely on, but in fact, they impact adversely on long-run growth. So there are ongoing output and employment losses. In other words, it's not simply there isn't simply a growth path that you pop off when you're having a recession and then go back onto when the economy is recovered. It permanently affects the long-run growth path. And it's a combination of both lack of capital investment, but also a lack of investment in skills because people are unemployed and not gaining job-relevant skills. So recessions reduce the productive capacity of the economy in the longer term, and therefore it's vitally important that following a recession, there is rapid fiscal policy, a rapid fiscal policy response, and possibly assisted by monetary policy. The Grattan Institute say that we can get unemployment down to 4 to 5%, and that will trigger faster wage growth. But the literature that I referred to, which is not MMT, have no real coherent discussion of full employment. So there's a reliance on a whole series of policy measures, but no way of actually achieving full employment. And if you rely on pump priming, which is simply governments engaging in levels of expenditure and possibly cutting taxes, it's more than likely that stimulus measures will cease too early and high unemployment will persist because there will be a fear of inflation. Okay, moving quickly to federal government policy and pushback. We know about Job Seeker and JobKeeper. There were, excuse me, there were loans for business, assistance for airlines. There was a dreadful home build scheme. Already the federal government is pushing back against these levels of spending. There is a view that all government spending must be ultimately paid back. So even though government has fiscal policy capacity, which they would never have acknowledged before, in other words, sudden and large outlays, there is still the imposition of higher taxes in the future, allegedly. The government certainly signalled ongoing industry support. They've slightly changed their rhetoric about JobKeeper and JobSeeker, but their future is still somewhat uncertain. They've also been very resistant to, over many, many years, in fact, minimum wage increases, even though Australia has a chronic wage problem. Minimum wages, moving minimum wages up is very important because the low paid have a high propensity to consume. There is obviously an issue of equity if the minimum wage is lagging, which it has done for many years. Of course, the hostility to minimum wage adjustment is based on a piece of neoclassical microeconomics, which says that if you raise the price of a good or commodity, such as labour, then the demand falls. The problem with that microeconomic relationship is that we're actually talking about the macroeconomy, and the so-called fallacy of composition is very important here. Fallacy of composition warns one that trying to extrapolate from a micro relationship and arguing that a similar macro relationship holds is simply flawed. It's worth noting that if firms are not operating in very highly price-sensitive export markets, the notion that a minimum wage rise will cause some sort of financial ruin for, say, cafes and restaurants is simply nonsense. Just raise the price of cups of coffee, hamburgers, and so on. What's the problem in doing that? If owners of cafes and restaurants are all facing similar cost increases, then an individual cafe raising its prices would maybe suffer a competitive disadvantage, but more than likely all cafes would do the same thing. And equally, boosting the incomes of staff may even raise sales as well. So while it's important to ensure that companies remain viable and able to pay their staff, wage cuts and wage freezes simply make no sense at all. Minimum wage policies certainly stabilise aggregate spending on consumption, and consumption is a very high share of GDP. And this is particularly true when other social protection measures are linked to the minimum wage. It's interesting to note that Professor Ian MacDonald, who's at Melbourne University, many years ago at a conference when Julia Gillard was actually in charge of industrial relations, he said scrap the national wage case and increase the minimum wage by 4% per year, 2.5% for inflation and 1.5% for national productivity growth. So in other words, real wages would be rising at the rate of productivity growth. Unfortunately, both components of the little formula there are somewhat lower nowadays, but it's worth noting that minimum wages have not kept up with average wages. It's also important to note that Malcolm Turnbull's government presided over cuts to penalty rates. Interestingly enough, the OECD and IMF have really contradicted the discussion by the federal government some weeks ago about what they were going to do in future by arguing that strong fiscal support was warranted, and there was ample fiscal space to support the economic recovery. They have a somewhat curious view of what fiscal space is, which I won't go into, but they stated the authorities should be considering further stimulus once existing measures expire at the end of the third quarter. Such support should focus on improving resilience and infrastructure and strengthening the safety net and investing in energy efficiency and social housing. And this comes from a blog by Bill Mitchell. The pushback by the federal government demonstrates that the long-term remedies to neoliberal policy failures is more of the same. And I think there's a degree of truth in that. Now, possibly the federal government are rethinking their future strategies, and we'll wait and see what happens. But certainly, given we have failed businesses already, unemployment will not return to lower levels, those corresponding to pre-crisis, even if there is some industry assistance. In other words, there's got to be much more. Now, I'm going to skate over some of this policy discussion. I'll make the slides available so you can have a look at your leisure. As I mentioned, there has been an unfortunate tendency for industrial relations reform to work very much against the interests of working people, both in terms of wage stagnation, but also in terms of changes in the precariousness of work. And that has clearly contributed to rising inequality. What is not recognized by most industrial relations specialists, though, is that the capacity of firms to treat workers badly, whether this is in terms of part-time and casual work, or in terms of underpayment of wages, is very much dictated by the state of the labour market. And firms can essentially get away with it when there are quite high rates of unemployment, particularly in respect of the vulnerable, so young workers, women and migrants. So so a full employment strategy is required. It's also important to strengthen national employment standards to support worker health and safety in response to future outbreaks of this or other viruses. And this really requires all workers have the opportunity of paid sick leave, so they do not continue to work when sick. So this applies to casual workers and also the gig jobs where there's no income security and none of the basic conditions that workers in the regular labour market enjoy. Now, interestingly enough, the Grattan Institute's very much in support of a rise in job seeker of at least $100 a week. And they say that would bring the job seeker allowance in line with what it was relative to full-time wages back in 1994. But they do acknowledge that this would be an interim measure because really broad reform of the income support system is needed. Now, the cries for a rise in job seeker have been going on for at least 10 years. I remember teaching it, and even then there were professional economists arguing in favor of a significant rise, and of course that argument has intensified since the beginning of the pandemic. And also that job seeker should be benchmarked to the growth of wages. It's interesting, Australia has the highest real minimum wage in the OECD, but the lowest unemployment benefit, i.e. job seeker, as a ratio of average wages. So job seeker of $387.25 a week would be just 51.4% of the weekly minimum wage. So arguments about the reduced incentive to work associated with raising job seeker are a nonsense. And the Grattan Institute talk about these issues at some length in terms of studies that have looked at incentive. So what else am I going to talk about in respect of sustaining raising incomes? I think I'll leave most of this. Clearly, the partner income test and mutual obligation framework needs to be reviewed too, as well. The ability of workers to access superannuation is simply bad policy in respect of it's a simple way out for government to avoid compensating workers adequately for the pandemic. And I think it's just appalling policy and should never have been introduced. The Grattan Institute also talk about raising rent assistance as well. And they supply estimates of the costs of these initiatives with respect to job seeker and rent assistance. Unfortunately, they spoil some quite well argued statements with some nonsense about government financing. So their hearts are in the right place, but their understanding of macroeconomic principles is a bit lacking. So I'm going to leave this as well, I think. I think training is an important, or clearly a very important issue, but given the scale of and speed of the recession, the notion that people can be trained up to meet the change in the structural composition of jobs is somewhat naive. I mean, people are, well, some are young, some are older. Some have major commitments in terms of paying mortgages or paying quite high rents. And the idea that a significant segment of the unemployed can go off and engage in major training programs is, well, it's simply not going to happen. And it's much better to get people into work and have on-the-job training rather than trying to anticipate where the jobs are going to come from. Right. Childcare, I think, is very important, and the way the government's treated it was good to start with free childcare and JobKeeper payments, but the changed arrangements over the last few weeks spells some real problems ahead if utilisation rates in childcare centres drops, which is more than likely unless workers are protected against, well, the end of JobKeeper and JobSeeker. Australia has a very high out-of-pocket expenses for childcare, which has a major impact on partners, typically women's labour force participation. And of course, the tax system plays some role there too. And Grattan Institute argue for a higher childcare subsidy, starting at 95% for low-income workers, and a flatter, simpler taper. In other words, the rate at which the subsidy goes down as the income of the parents goes up. Reviving business, well, we know about JobKeeper. Of course, JobKeeper has been less generous to businesses that rely on particular types of workers which are not covered, temporary visa holders, short-term casuals in particular, and these sectors here, hospitality, retail, healthcare, aged care, and the arts and recreation are particularly affected. GI argue for JobKeeper to be made available to universities in semester 2, again subject to the reduction in turnover, which I think was 30%, which then enabled individuals and organisation of firms to apply for JobKeeper. The arguments about about universities and their export earnings, etc., are well known, and I'll leave that there. The problem that government faces in respect of businesses is they don't want to be trying to sustain businesses which really have no long-term future. And that is clearly a difficult balancing act. It's interesting to note that 43% of businesses have engaged in some form of innovation in respect of their operations since the beginning of the pandemic. It's also important, of course, to recognize that some businesses are operating in industries which are strategically important and should be sustained, but then we have to have a debate about which industries are strategically important. Airlines, of course, have their major problems. We know about Qantas's 6,000 jobs which are being cut. I would assume nobody will be leaving the organisation until JobKeeper ceases. Virgin's likely to cut a higher percentage of staff. The challenge in terms of supply chains and this dependence on trade is a very tricky one in terms of how to, in the first instance, broaden import sources so that one's not reliant on a particular country for particular types of imports. But in the longer term, whether some of these imported inputs should be produced domestically. And that's a difficult challenge to sort out as to what is the best strategy. Infrastructure, there's been massive underinvestment in infrastructure. In the 60s, public investment was 9% of GDP, it is now 5%. And the pandemic has exposed all sorts of problems with the health system, which we are all familiar with, so I won't dwell on that. I think one thing which strikes me nowadays is that we really need to rethink aged care and equally childcare. My view is that they're really not compatible with being operated by the private sector, unless we have an army of inspectors ensuring that they're maintaining standards. Anyway, that's perhaps something we can discuss. Clearly, more treatment in mental health is needed. And then, of course, there are issues of what infrastructure should be invested in and a qualification about the infrastructure which is really reliant on population growth. So that may mean that certain projects should be delayed. if people prefer traveling by car, maybe congestion charging is necessary. So then we have various strategies in respect of the environment, and I'm going to leave those. I'll let you read them because I don't want to completely ignore modern monetary theory. But certainly with respect to investment in alternative energy sources, commitment to targets, and indeed the net emissions of zero by 2050 are all important considerations in respect of developing strategies. Now, finally to MMT principles, because I do want to get on to the issue of a job guarantee and how important it would be in the current environment. So, some of you may be familiar with this very short summary of what MMT is. It combines principles of chartalism and functional finance, but it's very much grounded in institutional practice. So chartalism argues that fiat money has value because the requirement to pay taxes means that people value it, and indeed people will use the fiat currency for transactions other than paying the tax man or woman. The emphasis in respect of chartalism is the ability of a fiat currency issuing in sovereign government to pursue independent fiscal policy. And this is subject to running a flexible exchange rate and not having, ideally not having any foreign denominated debt. Then there is the principles of functional finance, the idea that governments can actually target full employment and there are no financing problems in targeting full employment. And institutional practice is simply how the key macro institutions say they operate, and not the nonsense that you find in most orthodox textbooks. And I speak from some experience here because a group of us wrote a paper about orthodox textbooks and how bad they are in terms of how these key institutions behave. Now, monetary policies remain the main arm of macro policy, even through the global financial crisis, even though there was a short period of fiscal stimulus. And really the mix of loose monetary policy and tight fiscal policy has persisted in this country and in the UK and US, both of which experienced their longest recessions following the GFC. As most people will know, the capacity of monetary policy to operate is somewhat restricted by low rates prevailing in most developed economies, and ostensibly there being a zero lower bound as a constraint. Quantitative easing is also being practiced, but it's not terribly effective. Now, of course, the so-called zero lower bound was breached back in 2015 when the target interbank rate was set negative by Sweden and Japan. And the Japanese policy rate cut into negative territory would exert further downward pressure on rates across the yield curve. In other words, the rates of bonds of different maturities. In other words, some bonds expire in 3 months, some in 6 months, some in 12 months when they have to be repaid. The ECB, of course, have a negative target rate. What hasn't happened, to my understanding, is the customers of banks being subject to a negative deposit rate. And that's an interesting issue. And the IMF still talks about imposing deep negative interest rates in the expectation that banks will then use their reserves. Well, first of all, they'll economize on reserves because their reserves will be attracting a negative interest rate, but they'll use those reserves for lending. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, banks don't use their reserves for lending. Now, the IMF, as I say, is pursuing the idea, or has been pursuing the idea, of deep negative interest rates. But the problem then is that customers will, if interest rates are negative enough, and deposit rates are in fact negative, customers will ultimately say, well, I'm not going to hold a deposit account, and will withdraw their money, which will have major impacts on the banks. So the IMF stance here is that monetary policy works. We need to use negative rates to make it work better when rates are low and positive. And really, fiscal policy can be kept on hold. But central bankers for a long time have been arguing that monetary policy alone doesn't work. And that's central bankers in the UK, US, as well as this country. Now, the RBA, of course, had a second meeting in March and cut the cash rate down to 0.25%. And it's actually implementing limited yield curve control because it wants to keep the 3-year yield on bonds, government bonds, at 0.25%. And they expect that this will contribute to the long-term goals of full employment and inflation. So this is really quantitative easing, the Reserve Bank intervening in bond markets to make sure the bond rate for a particular maturity is at a particular value. Most heterodox economists would agree the days of monetary policy as an active policy tool are over. And then the question is how you set monetary policy. And there's a debate about whether you set a fixed nominal rate or a fixed real rate. And which one you set has implications for the distribution of income. Because as we know, retirees are reliant, or many retirees are reliant on interest income. Certainly, there are many advantages of permanently low rate. It removes uncertainty from the point of view of investment, but it can create an incentive for speculation in financial assets unless there are constraints on bank lending. Now, MMT advocates typically argue that full employment and price stability is of central importance. Here are a few fiscal principles. Treasury spending is not constrained. If government debt is issued and sold when deficits are run, interest rates don't rise. So the idea that when public sector spending goes up, private sector expenditure is driven down by higher interest rates does not hold. Government spending is not financed in the present or the future by taxation. So future generations don't need to worry that they're going to have a large bill to pay down the track. So a fiscal deficit today does not impact on the capacity to run a fiscal deficit tomorrow. The constraints on government spending are not financial, but they arise from the real capacity constraints in the economy, which constrain not government expenditure by itself, but government spending and non-government spending too. In other words, it's total spending, which has got to be constrained. Now, sometimes concerns are raised that if interest payments on debt were very high, then government spending capacity could be constrained. And firstly, it's exceedingly unlikely that interest payments would become very high, since central banks can set interest rates. But if they did, so let's say interest payments on debt was 10% of GDP, then the government would have a political choice about the balance of spending between the government sector and the non-government sector. So the government sector is committed to paying 10% of GDP in the form of interest payments, and it's got some social programs it wants to introduce, and it may feel it needs to squeeze the non-government sector to accommodate those spending plans within the constraints of the economy, the real constraints. So again, it's not a financing issue. It's all about being a real resource constraint. Now, again, it's worth pointing out that these sort of ideas are not embraced by the commentators on policies to address the pandemic. Now, I might leave OMF just so we can move to full employment fiscal policy. OMF is discussed in a short paper that I wrote, which is available somewhere on the Modern Money Australia website. Now, let's quickly provide some background. We know demand is weak in the economy. It's noteworthy that household saving actually rose to 5.5% of disposable income. And that's a consequence both of precautionary behavior. In other words, we better save more because we don't know whether we'll still have jobs in the future, but also restricted opportunities to buy goods and services. It's also important that to note that World Bank projected global growth is going to be negative, which will impact on exports. Private sector capital spending has fallen really since the mining boom ended, which really highlights the importance of public investment. Now, most commentators advocate some sort of rather wishy-washy transition to full employment by simply spelling out the sort of programs that I've discussed in the last few minutes. But as I say, that really only just pays lip service to full employment without actually achieving it. And typically there will be inflation fears when unemployment gets to even 5%, let alone 4%. This sort of juggling act between trying to raise employment closer to full employment and at the same time maintain inflation at a low level is really addressed by a job guarantee, because job creation is perfectly calibrated with the employment needs of both unemployed and underemployed workers. So it's not a hit or miss exercise where a certain amount of expenditure takes place and government hopes that that will get close to its idea of full employment. The job guarantee also has a built-in counter-inflation mechanism. And for the benefit of those who are not familiar with the job guarantee, it is a stabilization policy, and that is important. And I'll come back to that point a bit later rather. A fixed money wage per hour is paid for a job which is available to anybody who is willing and able to work. So there's effectively an infinitely elastic labour demand for workers at the minimum wage. It should be a livable wage and can be supplemented with a benefits package. It should be adjusted annually, as I said, in respect to the minimum wage. So again, job creation is perfectly calibrated. It's an employment buffer stock rather than an unemployment buffer stock. And it's an unemployment buffer stock that neoliberals use to control inflation. you get a smooth transfer of labour between sectors, so from a job guarantee job to a private sector job, because job guarantee workers are paid a minimum wage, and therefore they don't need the private sector to increase their wages to attract them. Some private sector firms obviously pay minimum wages, and that's a choice a JG worker can make. I'm not going to increase my pay by moving to a minimum wage private sector job, but I may improve my long-term career opportunities. But if a job guarantee worker is going to get it greater than the minimum wage at a firm, then that's fine, and there's a smooth, seamless transfer. And the other characteristic of job guarantee workers is they are job ready. They have experienced work, paid work. And so it's a very different situation when a firm is considering hiring a long-term unemployed person who hasn't worked for 12 months. Type of job is determined by local government, who are informed about unmet social and other needs. This decentralized decision-making helps reduce policy lags and creates jobs near where people live. JG has two types of counterinflation sanction. Firstly, that the availability of job-ready, job guarantee workers means that employers may well resist inflationary wage demands from current employees. And at the last resort, government cannot operate tight fiscal policy without sacrificing the job guarantee, which has the effect of squeezing the private sector and driving some workers into a job guarantee job with income loss in many cases. And that provides some sort of sanction. Now, job guarantee jobs must not be crucial, because there will be flux with respect to job guarantee job holders. They will move to the private sector if they are attracted by higher wages and a reasonable commute and all the rest of it. Now, in blog posts recently, Bill Mitchell has reported on our spreadsheet calculations based on a job guarantee to reduce the unemployment rate from 10% to 4%, trying to take account of hidden unemployment along the way. Now, clearly, 10% is a somewhat arbitrary starting point. Also, we don't take fully into account underemployment, because underemployment data is actually deteriorated. Once upon a time, you could get the distribution of underemployment across employees and also know how many hours they were already working. And this is important in terms of working out tax receipts. So whether it's somebody who's already working 18 hours and wants another 20 hours of work, or somebody who's working 5 hours and wants another 20 hours, obviously there are tax repercussions of that. Now, these calculations have been checked many times, particularly in the last 24 hours. And this is based on the unemployment rate being at 10% and then a job guarantee being introduced to drive the unemployment rate down to 4%. Now, this is an extreme case in the respect that there is no public sector spending. There's simply JG jobs being created. And essentially what's required is a total change of employment of 1326, so 1.3 million by our calculations. And we'll get about 1 million job guarantee jobs, 271,000 private sector jobs, because when workers get a job guarantee job, they start spending. Now, some have already got unemployment benefit. Now they will lose that, but they will experience clearly a rise in their weekly income. Even with the coronavirus supplement, you're better off, obviously, getting 750 a week than getting 550 a week under Job Seeker with the supplement. So this has been carefully worked out. It's not as good as it ideally would be, and the constraints are data constraints. So there's about 110 billion extra GDP. Gross government outlays is 77 billion, I beg your pardon. Net outlays are about 52. So what we're picking up there is extra tax receipts and lower unemployment benefits, since people, many people are earning unemployment benefits. And we're also capturing the hidden unemployment. So in other words, we're reverting to the higher rate of labour force participation. Now, this is an extreme scenario because the job guarantee is really not designed just to meet the employment gap, whatever it may be, whether it's a 6 percentage point unemployment gap or a 2% or a 4%. So the alternative extreme, if you like, is to say, okay, no job guarantee, we'll engage in pump priming, but we're very smart and we can anticipate what's happening in the economy, and we'll hit our 4% target with an appropriate level of public sector spending, which involves, of course, paying people average public sector wages and not the minimum wage. And this gives you a different picture, clearly, a much greater outlay by government. 145 billion with net outlays of 93. Now, clearly there is going to be public spending. It's not going to be, if there was a job guarantee introduced, spending wouldn't be purely on a job guarantee. So if we're looking at orders of magnitude, then the impact on government outlays will lie somewhere between these two figures of 93 and 52. So that gives you an idea of orders of magnitude, but in fact, one has to be very cautious about arguing that this is a good number or a bad number, because government is not financially constrained. So I'm always cautious about churning these numbers out because it conveys the impression that, yes, we are concerned that what net government outlays would be. Well, strictly we're not. We're more concerned about achieving some target. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Now, before stopping, and I realise I've taken about an hour. It's very important to realise what the job guarantee is and what it isn't. Often mention of a job guarantee leads to a wish list of what government should do to meet the needs of particular interest groups. Now, I guess the earlier part of my talk was a bit like that. This is particularly true in the US with the discussion of the Green New Deal, which is every interest group saying what they want, like cancel student debt, get rid of student fees, in the US case, make health services free, and so on. It's important to realise that the job guarantee is an important automatic stabiliser in the macro economy. First and foremost, that's what it is. It also happens to be a job creation program, but it's really there to stabilize the economy. There's flux, as I've mentioned earlier, flux in the job guarantee pool. You've got workers spread across the country. You've got some workers attracted to high paying jobs. You've got others who enter the pool after losing jobs or as a new labour market entrant. Now, if I was asked by anybody as to what the first priority of any sort of job guarantee arrangement would be, it would be to deal with the rather awful circumstances of the bushfires in the various states, where there is still an enormous amount of work to do in terms of clearing up properties and bushland areas and getting houses rebuilt. And certainly that should take priority over some ridiculous home building renovation type scheme. Also, there are all sorts of improvements to local infrastructure that can be a good job guarantee job. Okay, I've talked for long enough. The pandemic has thrown up major social, public health and economic challenges to the state and federal, so that states as well as the federal government. In general, of course, the public health issues have been dealt with well, despite the emergence of the secondary spike in Victoria. Certainly the crisis has highlighted major fault lines running in the macroeconomy. And it's encouraging that commentators, or some commentators, do acknowledge now these fault lines much more than they used to. Certainly a long-term economic response to the crisis is essential. And this paper really argues that in addition to labour market and industrial relations reforms, we need a commitment to full employment. And this can be achieved by a federally funded, locally administered job guarantee. And this will have the beneficial effect that vulnerable groups in the labour market will really have an opportunity to be paid the appropriate amount and treated in an appropriate way. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Where am I? Okay, so those of you who would like to ask a question live, if you can raise your hands. Otherwise, I'll read your questions out from the top, starting from the top. There are 17 questions. And if you can write, maybe put your questions in the Q&A, so I can just go through that section rather than the chat. So let's see who's raised their hands. We might go for the live questions first. Let's see. Sorry, just need to see who, 3. So we have Wayne, Lachlan and Helen. We'll start with Wayne, because I see you've got quite a few questions in the Q&A box. So I've just unmuted you, Wayne, and if you want to go video live, then I think you can do that from your end.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't think you can go video live. Something's wrong. You won't be able to see me.
Okay, that's all right.
I've got a couple of questions. I guess the main question I wanted to ask Martin was, does he think there will be a large hysteresis effect after this, not reversion, but recession? And that's the question, I guess, that I'm concerned about. Yeah.
Well, I think it very much depends on the speed and effectiveness of federal government policy action. If they sit back and assume that they've done their job in terms of JobKeeper and Job Seeker, and that we can sort of revert to normal, then we're going to have a real problem. I mean, I should add, of course, that the progress of the pandemic and whether we have secondary spikes in other states should influence what they do anyway. But I mean, let's say by the end of the year, we think the virus is under control, then, well, there's been some deterioration even over, over 9 months in terms of the skills and experience of workers who haven't worked. So there's still a significant problem. But it really, as I say, it really depends on speed of federal government action subject to the constraints of the pandemic.
Thank you.
Okay. So actually, I might go to Kevin Gaynor's question, which is, if the current Conservative federal government adopt an interpretation of the job guarantee, say a federally funded national jobs scheme, and run it like a work for the dole by forcing unemployed into inappropriate jobs, might this damage the notion of a job guarantee as it is intended? So,
well, you've highlighted an interesting question, which has been around for quite some time, really ever since there's been discussion of the job guarantee, which is quite some years. If there are sufficient jobs in the economy, private sector and job guarantee jobs, and public as well, is it appropriate to maintain some sort of welfare support for those who choose not to take up a job? Now, if there is welfare support for those who don't take up a job, then one is advocating essentially a basic income.
Yeah.
Albeit not a universal one. So it's restricted to those who choose not to work. Now, I think that's a difficult question to really address. I guess my view would be, if the job guarantee is implemented well, and you might argue I'm dodging the question here, but I shall continue. And there is adequate choice, particularly in regional areas, then certainly people have some sort of civic citizen responsibility to contribute to society. Now, certainly in years gone by, the notion that the unemployed have got to be bullied and hassled has been abhorrent because there haven't been enough jobs. Now we're considering a scenario where there are enough jobs, but then it comes down to, is there an adequate range of jobs? So it may, older people may be disinclined to be pulling up lantana and trekking along riverbanks and removing, plastic and all the rest of it. So yes, it's a discussion that needs to be had.
Okay, all right. So we might go live now to Lachlan. I'll just unmute you now, Lachlan, so you can ask your question.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, Martin. Thanks for that. Let me just, I have popped my question in the Q&A to write it up. Now, I'm sorry, I was going to try and look for Alison Pennington and Jim Stanford's work in this space. I know they published stuff in the Journal of Australian Political Economy recently, but Alison mentioned during her presentation at the January conference, she said, she essentially alluded to, and I really want to dig into the argument, but into the literature, but she said it is possible to achieve true full employment, that is to say sub-Nehru unemployment, with low and stable inflation without a buffer stock of any kind, without either an employed or an unemployed buffer stock. And instead, she'd argue, the argument being partly a normative one, that, you know, really an employed buffer stock is morally obviously superior to an unemployed one, but really ideally workers don't want to be in any kind of buffer stock. And her argument, I believe she alluded to only briefly, she said there are potentially other counter-inflationary policy mechanisms. I think she referenced a return to centralised wage fixing, for instance, and some others. I'm sorry I don't have a bit more detail, but essentially she alluded to the idea that it'd be possible to construct other counter-inflationary policy mechanisms that would allow for true sub-Nehru genuine full employment, but without using a buffer stock at all. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that, but I suppose also B, in this climate when we're trying to, all of us supporters of true full employment are trying to kind of bring the various arguments together. Is it possible that we could potentially have, say, a combination of them? You know, you bring in centralized wage fixing and and it means that you're as you alluded to, your employment buffer stock is, say, 1% of the workforce instead of, say, 2 or 3 or 4%. Just keen on your thoughts.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Let me answer the last bit first. If we have full employment with a job guarantee, then it would seem to me that the fluctuation in the size of the job guarantee pool of workers would be relatively small. And I think it is absolutely vital that anyway the pool of JG workers by design is relatively small. So if you ended up with, let's say, 100,000, well, it may be difficult because of the size of the country and the disparity, the people being all over the place and working in remote areas and so on. But certainly the notion, as I mentioned earlier, that okay, we have an employment gap of 6%. In other words, the unemployment rate 6% too high. Therefore, we're going to fill that with predominantly JG is not the way to go. I mean, it's an easier calculation for us, and that's where it ends. So, yes, in an ideal world, you have a very small JG pool, which is big enough to deal with the fluctuations in the private sector, which, as I say, should be less than they would be at a high rate of unemployment. In terms of whether we can do without an employment buffer stock, this argument's been put forward by Malcolm Sawyer. And I mean, it's a combination of two issues. One is the inflation issue, which you mentioned. And I mean, he talks in terms of incomes policy, and okay, we can talk about centralized wage fixation. That's fine. The other thing is, and I touched on it indirectly by my public sector numbers. The other is the government is clever enough, and, or I should say Treasury, clever enough to anticipate what's going to happen to private sector employment and engage in adequate public sector spending to keep the economy at full employment. And I'm very skeptical about that. And one only has to look at the Treasury stuff up, for choice of a better word, apropos of JobKeeper. The economy is not predictable enough to, just getting rid of some nonsense on my screen, is not predictable enough so that one can set public expenditure at a level which will just achieve the rate of unemployment that you want. I mean, there's going to be some unemployment, maybe 2%, ideally. So that's where I see it as a major problem. And if you get rid of the employment buffer stock, then you do potentially have a serious wages problem, because if Treasury underestimates what the private sector is doing and creates too many public sector jobs, then you start getting competition between the public and private sector for workers, and you get inflating wages. Whereas, you know, it comes back to the point that the JG is perfectly calibrated, because if somebody wants a job, they go and ask for one with the appropriate agency. So, yeah, I think there are two issues there: hitting the target and keeping inflation down.
Thanks very much.
Right.
Okay, and I don't know that we have enough time to get to all the questions. I'm sorry, but I mean, it's now 3:30, so I might do one more question from the Q&A box. Sorry, I just see there's a question here from Peter Martin. So, are you neutral on continuing rapid population growth, and do you think it is an issue? So, Peter Martin, thank you. And
well, I think rapid population growth is an issue, a major issue. I'm curious that commentators say that it's so good for Australia when, in fact, per capita GDP growth has been going down, whereas the positive rate of GDP growth we've had until, of course, the recent turn down has been largely driven by population growth. So it seems curious that we'll be just looking to have a positive growth rate and therefore be able to claim we've had 30 years without a recession, when it's really only driven by population growth without the average material living standards rising. But in terms of where population or immigration policy goes, I think there's a lot of discussion to be had in terms of, you know, large capital cities becoming less and less pleasant to live in, given the high concentrations of population, the pressures to, you know, build apartment blocks and all the rest of it. And, you know, we know that apartment blocks are not necessarily a very desirable form of living when you have a pandemic.
all right, thank you. And we'll have Helen Clemens. I'll allow you to talk now so you can ask your question. Hello, Helen.
I didn't ask a question, sorry.
Oh, okay. You had the hand is raised. That's okay. It must have been an accident. All right. We'll do one more question from the Q&A box. So let's see. Sorry. Let's have a look. Is there any, let me see, it's hard to filter through all of them. I might go to, Anne has a couple of questions about the, how quickly could a JG be introduced in the current circumstances? And to what extent could a JG mitigate the usual effects of a recession? So,
well, there are Centrelink offices spread around the country. So we do have an administrative structure in place. Now, it's not an administrative structure to organise jobs paid for by local councils and financed by government. but certainly the Centrelink would be converted. Now, I mean, it will take time, undoubtedly, but that, at least there is some sort of administrative structure in place, albeit there will be a need to refocus its activities. And I would think that local councils would have a pressing list of priorities in terms of spending, some relatively small outlays, which can be used, to, if they have the money, to support local workers doing, fairly straightforward tasks. So to put a time on it, that's exceedingly hard. But I think we're not. It shouldn't take 6 months. Maybe 3 months. When you think about compiling a list of jobs and fielding inquiries from people who are unemployed and so on. It may even be able to be done sooner. But clearly there are some technical changes needing in terms of computer capacity and what have you, and what the sort of data they record to essentially marry workers with available jobs.
Okay, thank you. So we have Richard Bentley, Alistair Leith and Franzi Poldy requesting to ask a question live. So do we have time, Josh, and are you happy to stay around, Martin? Is that?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, all right, so you're welcome to stay for the further questions. So Richard, I'm going to allow you to talk now so you can ask your question. Hi, Richard. Can you?
Yep, I've found the button.
Okay, cool.
I'd just like to ask or suggest that we're missing a great opportunity to actually analyse what has now been a short period of income guarantee, because there's been a doubled, as I understand it, unemployment benefit without the obligation of looking for work, or there wasn't much work out there to look for anyway. And there's been benefits to many people that have already, I've seen expressed in chat comments about they've been able to maintain their rental and feed themselves properly for the first time. There's increased spending in some retail outlets. Bunnings and Woolworths and Coles and places like that have done quite well through this pandemic period. So I think we should have a look at that, because I think you overestimate the ease with which a job guarantee can be put in. I've worked with in unemployment services for quite a long time with CDEP programs and worked for the dole programs and that sort of thing. And it's not cheap to run those sort of job programs. So there'll be extra costs on top of them. I'm not saying they shouldn't be done, but in actual fact, the income guarantee gives people more flexibility and peace of mind, and maybe would flow through it over the longer term into a better outcome for everyone.
Well, certainly the effectively doubling the job seeker allowance with that supplement has starkly revealed the inadequacy of the normal job seeker. There's no argument about that. And indeed, as I say, many organizations, economists and so on have been arguing for this for a very long time. I don't see that justifies long-term support for people who are of working age and capable of work. And the studies that have taken place over the years about the both the economic and social impact of unemployment suggests that, like it or not, people do have many social as well as economic benefits from working. And the rate of mental illness, family violence, etc., are much higher amongst people who are unemployed. Now, you might argue that society's got its values wrong, and why do we treasure work so much? People do gain intrinsic benefits from working. Now, it's not to say that every job is intrinsically both worthwhile and enjoyable. That's certainly not the case. But in a fully employed economy, people will have more choice as to what they do, and jobs which are dull and uninteresting, employers may well have to change the way they're structured and give their employees more autonomy and all the rest of it. So, I mean, I've written and with Bill and by myself about, the contrast between pursuing a universal basic income versus a job guarantee. And I don't think we've changed our views over, well, at least 15, 20 years, but I'm happy to talk to you at another time about it.
Okay.
Thanks, Richard. So I'll just mute you now, and he's gone. So Alistair, I'll allow you to talk now to ask your question.
Hi there. I guess it's a bit of a minor question in a way. It's more of an implementation thing. But it's often put by MMT advocates that job guarantee be funded federally, and we all know why, and implemented at perhaps the local government level. And I'm just concerned that the same kind of media bashing from the Murdoch news outlets around unemployed people could be deployed attacking councils. They have varying capacities to do that kind of work and various levels of corruption, as all governments do. And yeah, I'm just wondering whether that's the best way to do it, or whether it could be hybridized or what. So that's my question.
Yes, I mean, there have got to be controls in place and accountability. That is undoubtedly the case. But as far as local councils or local councils having the responsibility, I think they know their particular council area very well, and if there are problems, whether it's an uneven footpath, they soon get told by their constituents. So I think in terms of identifying things that need to be done, then operating at the local council level is appropriate. But yes, certainly there have got to be safeguards to avoid corruption. There's got to be a significant accountability.
All right. Thanks, Alistair. I'll just mute you now. And Franzi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'll allow you to talk and ask your question. Hello, Franzi. Are you there? No, let's unmute again. Okay. So we might go actually just to one more question from the Q&A box. And I saw that Rod O'Donnell was one of the first to ask some questions. So Rod, let's see, you ask, is it correct that some MMT people don't see eye to eye with—
Hello?
Hi, Franzi, is it?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, okay. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. It's a very general question about the presentation of modern monetary theory. Perhaps two questions. One is to note that you present modern monetary theory as a set of principles rather than as a correct description of the way things actually are. And I'm just wondering whether from a a scientific point of view, in other words, trying to establish what the actual facts of the matter are, it wouldn't be better to treat it in a scientific way and say, okay, well, here we have a view which is in error to some degree, and here is the correct, here is a, if not the ultimately correct, at least a better description of what is going on. And related to that sort of set of issues is the question, to what extent do you think the opposition to MMT is based primarily on ignorance or on the interests of people who are benefiting from the current system?
Thanks very much for your question. In terms of expressing MMT principles, I must say that's not something I've done before. I normally present it in a different way, and the reason for doing it was more for economy, in terms of saying, well, I hope at least some of the audience can accept these arguments as they are on the basis of the fact that they've been exposed to MMT in the past. No, I'm a strong believer in talking about institutional practice and pointing out that, you know, the Bank of England says this about the monetary system, the Reserve Bank says this, and so on and so forth. So I'm much more comfortable having a much longer narrative about what central banks in particular, and the Bank of International Settlements for that matter, what they say about essentially the workings of the monetary system and the implications for fiscal policy and whether it needs to be financed and all that sort of thing. So that was really just very much a shortcut. In terms of your second question, I think there is clearly a lot of ignorance, because people find the ideas totally counterintuitive, particularly in respect of the fact that they are budget constrained and somehow governments aren't. And I think getting people to understand that point is quite difficult. Clearly, there are a vast number of economists in particular who have made their reputations on the basis of providing advice which, from our perspective, would be viewed as very dubious. And their response has been, over the last, I don't know, 12 months, certainly post the textbook, has been highly dismissive, but often in the form of a Twitter. I come from an old school where it's the case that serious arguments cannot be confined to whatever the number of characters you're allowed in Twitter. So the intellectual foundations of a lot of the critiques that have been made, including, in fact, the US Senate motion, well, there isn't any intellectual foundation. I mean, they're just assertions, and that's the end of it.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have maybe one more question from the Q&A box? Is that okay with you, Martin?
Yeah, fine.
Okay.
I'm very happy. My extended family haven't come back, so that's good. Okay. I drove them out. So,
okay. So we have a couple of questions from Rod O'Donnell, so I'll read those out. Is it correct that some MMT people don't see eye to eye with post-Keynesian economics? If so, what are the reasons? And the other question is, according to MMT, do multinationals need to pay tax in the domestic economy, given that the bulk of their profits are repatriated overseas? So two separate questions, really.
Right.
Distinct.
We clearly have a lot of commonality with heterodox economists in general in respect of the functioning of the monetary system, the rejection of the money multiplier, the rejection of the quantity theory of money. I don't think that heterodox economists go into that stuff at a deep enough level. And my main criticism of heterodox economists is that while they make the right noises about, well, we clearly need reduced unemployment, they tend to adopt the Malcolm Sawyer arguments from way back, which is, well, we'll just have some pump priming and see where it gets us. So they don't, many of them seriously dislike the job guarantee. And I'm not entirely sure why, because as I explained earlier, if you don't have an employment buffer stock, you've got serious inflationary problems potentially, and also serious problems of actually hitting your target rate of unemployment.
Okay, and the other half of Rod's question was about the multinational.
Oh, multinationals.
Yeah.
I think the MMT take on taxes generally is very simple, and that is that the tax system should be equitable. I mean, it's not about we need to collect another $10 billion in taxes so we can pay for $10 billion of extra spending. It's that, you know, why should we be subsidizing foreign shareholders of Netflix or Amazon or whoever? So I'm perfectly comfortable with the Australian government saying they want their share, but you know, it's not for revenue raising, it's entirely about equity.
Okay, I actually might finish with a question. I just am curious as to if we were to, like Melbourne or Victoria, have to, go for a more widespread lockdown, and I mean, if the government were to fulfill their responsibility and secure, people financially with a wage replacement, is there a time limit on how long that could be done? And, is there a time limit on what sort of, on a lockdown period where before, the economy would be? I mean, I'm just wondering, is that an argument against a prolonged lockdown? And is that something that you can answer?
Well, various economists, including Adam Crichton, and I think an economist at New South Wales, have argued that we really do have a trade-off between the health of the population and the health of the economy. And well, I tend to veer on the side of the health of the population, simply on the grounds that while it's not ideal, the government can continue to support people who are unable to work for whatever reason in respect of the pandemic. Either they're not allowed, well, I suppose they are allowed out for any job, I suppose. There's no such thing as an essential job. It's if you have a job, you can
yeah, they are allowed out for work, at the moment.
Yeah, which could change.
It could change.
In which case, then, things get very difficult for families and individuals to survive. So no, I'm not. Well, I'll put it this way: I would take the advice of the health experts, and to give him credit, Scott Morrison has done that to a large extent, and unfortunately didn't do it when the bushfires were, and prior to the bushfires. Maybe he's learned something.
Okay, well, I will hand it back now to Joshua to sign off, and thank you very much, Martin. I've taken a few screenshots, so I'll be tweeting those out. And thank you everyone for coming along. All right, and Joshua, if you can show yourself.
Yes, hello again. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. I'd just like to thank Dr. Martin Watts again for sparing some time on his Saturday afternoon to talk to us all about, oh, my video's gone. Right, that was just a click of the button. Right, sparing some time of his on the Saturday to talk to us about the economy and the effects of COVID-19 upon the economy and how we can still pursue a full employment policy. And as well, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today for tuning in, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.